better to do.
Welcome to Season 1, Episode 7 of Nothing Better to Do podcast. If this is your first time, welcome to our hardcore version of a fireside chat. If you're a loyal listener, high fives and welcome back. My name is Sean. I run Another City Records, and virtually next to me, as always, is my absolute dear friend, Rich.
So,
Rich, do you want to tell us who we have on the show today?
absolutely. We have Larry Gargus of Splinter, the legendary Don Austin, and Persistent Aggressor, as well as Bleachmouth Postscript podcast. What's up, Larry?
Hey, how are you guys?
Doing well. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So, I guess just start out. What's your origin story? Like in terms of within punk and in that world.
I was bit by a radioactive crust punk outside of a show. And no, I have older cousins who were a part of, where they were there for the first wave of hardcore in the early 80s. And Tammy and Shelley had really great record collections. And I used to, spend a lot of time over at my uncle's house. And when I started taking ownership of music, right after I started listening to Black Sabbath, Black Sabbath, showed me that there were other possibilities out there. Like I was aware of music and stuff before it, but I didn't really care so much about it one way or the other. It was just like background. Once I heard Sabbath's first record, I was like, oh, well, what else is out there? It's not all the, skinny ties and Dayglow t-shirts and stuff. And so, I started thumbing through their records and kind of came across a lot of bands that really, I guess, inspired me to like seek out still more music. They had I think the first Black Flags Damaged and Leather Bristle Studs and Acne by GBH were the first punk records I bought with my own money. But in their collection, they had those records and like Negative Approach and Agnostic Front, Victim in Pain, like your usual suspects. And they were musicians, so it kind of sort of planted the seed in my head that, well, I'd like to be in a band, but that didn't come till much later. And so I went to a few shows in the mid 80s, 86, 87, but like bigger shows, and wasn't a part of anything local, or like, I didn't understand. I was still trying to find my way, and I was also listening to like all kinds of music concurrently with discovering punk and hardcore. So I didn't really dive head first into the quote unquote scene, as it were, until, I don't know, maybe my junior year in high school. I was living in Texas at the time, and I started going to more shows down there in Houston. And once I moved back, I started writing for a fanzine called Crunch Face. My buddy John had started it, and was gaining some traction in certain, scenes. The zine had a strong connection with with what was going on in Syracuse primarily, and that sort of thing. But by then I had started Splinter with some friends and started breaking away from that. I mean, that's it in a nutshell.
Regarding Houston, my impression of Houston in the late 80s, early 90s was a lot of Krishna kids. Is that fair, or was it just because they had a couple of bands of that ilk in Houston?
It's hard for me to say because, I didn't really, I was going to shows, but I wasn't a part of anything necessarily. And a lot of the shows I was going to see pretty much everything. Like, yeah, I saw Judge when I was living down there, but I was also going to see, like metal bands like Dead Horse and artsier weirdo bands like the Pain Teens and like, local.
Was Dead Horse from Houston? I know you
Yeah.
played him on a recent. Okay.
Yeah, Dead Horse is from Houston. They put out a self-released tape called Horsecore, an unrelated story
Yeah.
that's time consuming. And
Yeah, I remember reading about them in Metal Maniacs, I think.
yeah,
around
they
that
were
time, late 80s.
they were astonishingly good, and the fact that they didn't weren't more well known is kind of baffling to me. But that's just how things work out sometimes. Anyway, so I moved back to Akron, started writing for Crunchface, and hooked up with some other friends of mine that I knew from. They were all skaters, and we all listened to punk and hardcore and metal and stuff like that, and we conspired to start a band, and Splinter was born out of that.
So I was unfamiliar with Splinter. Rich sent it over. I was listening to it and comparing that with Persistent Aggressor. There's a lot of differentiation. I mean, differences there. Is that a more of a product of just the time difference in periods of your life, or is it more of what you were listening to then versus now, that sort of in the writing process?
It's funny because I think the biggest difference is like our one guitar player was in a late stage version of Splinter, and our other guitar player used to come to see Splinter shows, and I've been in 3 bands now with Josh. And so I think the difference is that together and separate from each other, we've all been playing music since 1990. Well, I started in 1990. Those guys are like a couple years younger, so they came along. So we've had a lot of time to sort of learn how to write songs and figure out what we were going to do. Because when we started Splinter, I was 17. And the bass player, drummer were both 17, and our guitar player was 14. So we kind of, and he wasn't even really a guitar player; he's a bass player. He had to learn how to play guitar because we kind of bullied him into buying a guitar because he had money and we didn't, and we were just basically like, we were torn between the idea of playing fast hardcore from the 80s, and we were listening to tons of Sepultura because, fucking Beneath the Remains and Arise were great records, and listened to a lot of Celtic Frost, and that stuff doesn't really always come through in the Splinter recordings, but we were a little more metal than I originally had sort of envisioned the band, whereas Persistent Aggressor, I think we're even more metal than that, but that's just how I've accepted things to sort of fall into place. I think the songwriting is just better. Yeah, it's because of time. I'm overthinking my answer. Just the time between then and now. I mean, that's 30 years ago that I was in Splinter, and we've just become better songwriters, and I listen to mostly a lot of the same stuff. I haven't really picked up a ton of new music except for like hardcore bands, like Laughing Gas and stuff like Chain Whip and Slant. But you're not going to hear any of that in Persistent Aggressor just because that's just not how I write. But as far as like the songwriting overall, the quality of it, it just has to do with the fact that we've been playing in a bunch of different bands for a couple decades now.
You ruined my mental gymnastics math. 1990 was 20 years ago. Don't tell me anything different.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you 100% on that.
With Splinter, I mean, you mentioned Celtic Frost and Sepultura, but like I always just sort of assumed not to belittle it, but it was music very much of the time.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
do you think that like was any of the New York hardcore of the time an influence, or was that just sort of you guys were pulling from the same pool of influences?
100%. I mean, I liked a lot of New York bands. Like I liked Breakdown. I loved Killing Time.
Mm-hmm.
we never really went into anything thinking, okay, this is how we're going to write these songs. We were just writing what we thought we could pull off for the most part. And, I mean, I've always told people that, we were very in line with what was coming out at the time, because we were
Yeah,
kids. People forget that when you're 17 and 18 and even early 20s, you're still a fucking kid. So there's a lot of
true.
stuff that, is very, you're not belittling anything. A lot of it's derivative in some ways. I think that there are good songs there. That's why, like, whenever I shared you that link of our stuff, I really just cherry picked the songs that I can listen to with that band.
It's funny. Rich sent me like the Splinter songs, and like I said, I hadn't heard them, and this isn't a knock at all. It's I could hear it just sounded 90s hardcore,
Yep.
and I'm like, Rich, I really like this. Does that mean I'm old?
Yes, it does. Yeah, it's weird. And we also kind of, another band that was a huge influence on us was a band you guys probably never heard of called Hyper as Hell. And they were very much pulling from a lot of metal and skate punk and stompy hardcore and stuff like that. So we might have been looking to that. And
Mhm.
I'd be a liar if I wasn't saying we weren't looking north to Cleveland. We weren't trying to sound like Integrity. We weren't trying to sound like Ringworm. But those bands, we were all kind of pulling from the same well, in a lot of
Sure.
ways. So, and we didn't really there wasn't an infrastructure in Akron for what we were trying to play. Like, there was no hardcore scene in Akron at the time at all. I mean, everybody went north to Cleveland to go to shows, and we weren't really a part of that. So we were kind of like in the wilderness, on our own. There wasn't really ever a hardcore scene in Akron, but there were bands from Akron that were hardcore in the early 80s, Zero Defects, Plasma Alliance, and later Hyper as Hell. But even they kind of floated north to Cleveland to play with bands like False Hope and Confront. And that was like 86, 87 through 1990 or whatever. But there really wasn't a scene. So, we were looking north to, they weren't our peers because we weren't really Clevo, but it was like, okay, well, I guess it must be okay to play metal, or have these stompier parts, but,
Yeah.
I wasn't always completely satisfied with what we were doing, but at the time I didn't play any instruments. So I just kind of left it in the hands of the guys who played instruments to sort of sort shit out, and I'm not making excuses because clearly there's stuff I really, really liked that we were doing. But, if I had my druthers, it probably would have sounded a little bit different, or maybe not. I don't know. It's hard to say. It's just hard to look back on something that still means the world to you, whether you actually enjoy the output or not. But it was such a really huge, important part of your life. It's hard to look at it objectively because there are some days where I'm hypercritical of it, and other days where I'm like, we were kids,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's really easy to feel conflicted with the era that kind of came into your own in terms of music. I mean, I know I've been dealing with that recently, like the bands in the shows I did in the early to mid 90s. And it's just such a weird feeling because on one end, you're like, oh man, we were young, we were stupid, everybody was dramatic. On the other end, it kind of makes you who you are as well.
Yeah, 100%. Like, one of the things I got into an argument with our one guitar player, Josh, the other day about this. I told him, I said, the 90s were clearly the worst period for hardcore and underground and punk music ever. And he goes, well, that's us, right? And I'm like, yeah, it is. And he said, well, are you romanticizing a time that you weren't a part of? He meant the 80s. And I'm like, no, because I don't know. The 80s were probably just as bad. I'm sure people, I think a lot of those folks sort of, uh, they talk about that period in the 80s in a very self-aggrandizing type of way, which you know, is a bit of a put off, but I'm quite sure that they're not being 100% honest. I'm sure there's a bunch of horse shit that went on then, but I'm just talking objectively about, you know, even though my band was very much part and parcel with the sound that was going on at the time in some respects. And I was aware of, you know, what was going to scene. I was putting on shows and doing zines and that whole thing. I was also pretty put off by a lot of it too, because this is where I'm a bit hypocritical, because although I love metal and I was, you know, in a band that was pretty stompy at points and very metal at other points, boy, I fucking hated, you know, like, I love Those Who Fear Tomorrow. I think that's a great record, but everything after that, I think for better or worse changed, and then metal became like the order of the day, you know, and I tend to think for worse, because people didn't sound like, you know, by and large, at least in my small bubble, there weren't any negative approaches. There weren't any SSD controls. There weren't any crucifix. There weren't any Decreatsons. It was all just, you know, bench warming metal bands, you know, and we could be accused of being that, you know, and that's perfectly fine, but it doesn't make my point any less valid, you know. And then the pushback to all that was equally ridiculous too. So it was a really trying time. I don't think that I think my favorite period of hardcore was really late 90s, early aughts, I think is, and, you know, and I was already pushing 30 at that point, and I was like, this is fun, you know. It was more fun then, I think, you know.
I think that was a good era. Like I would say the two most exciting times for me was when I started going to shows around 91. I was just excited because it was something new to me, and but yeah, like that era around 98 to somewhere around 2003, there was just a lot of things. And there's these periods, I think, in hardcore punk where where the lines are a little more blurred than at other times. So, like, you know, for example, the whole bandana thrash thing.
Yeah.
Like, there was that period where they were playing with bands that just wanted to be Judge or Youth of Today, and it was all good. And then somewhere along the line, there was falling outs between, like, you know, like that brand of hardcore and the quote unquote bandana thrash thing. But yeah, those periods when it's pure enough to where, like, people are just like, oh yeah, you know, we're all the same. We just maybe are pulling from a very slightly different, you know, influence pool, you know.
Yeah, hardcore is a weird thing. It's a small subgenre in the grand scheme of things, and the roots are pretty much all the same, you know, and it's reinterpretation with different, you know, as passing, you know, ages go by, it's everybody's just reinterpretation of that same influences, or you know, interpretations based on bands that were influenced by those same bands. And we see, you know, and it's not a knock, it's just you know, as every time a new crop of kids comes in, you know, that's just the reinterpretation. And sometimes you see straight kickbacks where, you know, the youth crew movement revival, or you'll see more metal stuff. It's just the kind of the nature of the beast. It's kind of cyclical in hardcore.
Yeah, and I don't always necessarily think that it's the interpretations that bother me. I mean, I use the metal influence pretty flippantly. You know, I don't really have a problem with that as much as I do the aesthetic and a lot of the nonsense that comes with these different iterations of hardcore, you know. Like in the 90s, you know, and I'm being real reductive here, it was either you had to go to a show to see a band, either you ran the risk of getting killed in the pit, like by some proto kickboxer, or you went to the show and kids were sitting down. And I was like, neither one of those appealed to me. And it was it was really difficult, you know, and we were building our own scene south of Cleveland. You know, Cleveland was a pretty big scene, and there were a lot of us that just didn't want anything to do with it, at least, in a real intense sort of way. There were places like Speak in Tongues, was a great haven up in Cleveland that had some really cool shows. But, you know, and again, I liked some of those bands, but we had our own thing down here. You know, it started out in the Crunch Face basement and moved further south to Canton because there was no place in Akron that would, lease a hall to us. We did it once and they were like, no more of this shit. None of the bars down here were clubs or whatever. We're going to put on all ages shows. So a lot of the shows moved to Canton, even though we were steadfastly an Akron band. But a lot of that scene was made up of bands that sounded wildly different. Like, I can't tell you how many shows we played with Harriet the Spy. We played
great band.
Tens, dozens and dozens of shows with Harriet the Spy. Those guys are my friends. We played with Party of Helicopters. We played with Ball Peen Gidget. And just, the shows were really mixed bills. So it wasn't always the interpretations that were annoying to me. It was like, a lot of the trends and things that came and went, and it just all was just frustrating. Not that everybody had to think the way I did, but back then I wasn't taking into consideration what I just said earlier, that we were kids and that's what kids do, and they go through phases and they adopt certain looks and behaviors, according to what their peer group is doing. And that was really frustrating for me back then, and all I wanted to do was play shows and, make music. So, I'm just kind of rambling on a train of thought there, but
with hardcore, it's bands on the coasts always tend to get a much bigger representation of in the fandom world, and being unapologetically from the Rust Belt. How do you think that influenced your music and the arc of bands you've been in?
Well, I think what it did was it sort of, like I said, I had that seed planted in my brain by my cousins that I wanted to be in a band. And I was really, really young when that kind of was put in there. But, I didn't buy into the idea that hardcore and punk bands were the same as the people that were going to the shows, because those bands from the coast is like, you could go see them, but there was still that separation. There was still that, we're performing, you're here to watch us perform. It wasn't until I started seeing Hypercell that I said, oh wait, I can do this, and I think that although the scenes on either coast were very much, DIY at some point and built up from the ground level, by the time I started seeing those bands and going to shows, they already had like this infrastructure set up that, pretty much catered specifically to their fan base on either coast, and or people who wanted to really adopt whatever sort of milieu they were operating in, like, so I sort of realized early on that, well, we're on our own here. We're just going to have to figure this out, just like with the Cleveland thing, it was like, we're gonna have to figure this out. And, I want to play shows and I like those bands, but I can't look to either coast for, as a template for how to get this done. The only thing I knew was that, okay, you start a band, you do a demo, you do a 7-inch, then you do an LP, and you play a bunch of shows, and you make the shows happen however they have to happen. We didn't have a CBGBs, we didn't have anything like that here, and that's, part of the whole movement towards the strong DIY aesthetic that was going on in the 90s, that whole undercurrent, and although we sounded like a lot of New York bands and we took a lot of influence from them, it wasn't anything I felt we were a part of or that we could participate in. It felt very separate. You know, like I said, we felt separate from Cleveland. Imagine how separate we felt from New York or Los Angeles or even Chicago, even though it's a Midwest city. I was like, yeah, that's Chicago, man. That's, you know, so.
And Chicago's so bizarrely, actually, in a way, kind of like New York at different points, just so insular.
Yeah.
Like, just bizarrely so. Like, I mean, when the Fireside happened, there was definitely, Chicago became a national scene at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But like, there's periods. Have you ever watched that? How into music documentaries are you, Larry?
I've watched quite a few. Some are way better than others.
Have you saw? I think it's called "You Weren't There."
Yep, I watched it, and
amazing documentary. It's like
I really liked it a lot. It was weird because it sort of changed my notion of what I thought about Chicago previously. Because if you think about the bands that were from there, they were all just so different. Like there wasn't a prevailing sound that you could easily identify as being this is a Chicago sound. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh no, yeah, that's kind of what I was going to get at. It's like, so I grew up, within 100 miles of Chicago. I lived in Chicago for a few years, and I'm also I would consider myself kind of a geek, a nerd about like music history, especially in the world of punk. And there was so much I had no clue about. Like it blew my mind, like living in Chicago. I knew of Out of Order, I knew Life Sentence, I knew Effigies, obviously I knew Naked Ray Gun and Big Black and all that. But like there were all these, honestly, I didn't know until sometime in the early aughts, this is going to sound weird, but I didn't know that Articles of Faith were from Chicago, because when I first heard of Vic Bondi Band, it was Jones Very, and they were from Boston.
Oh, okay.
So I just assumed AOF was from Boston.
Who's your favorite Chicago band? Both of you.
Probably Articles of Faith.
Okay.
Oh, man.
And you don't have to limit to hardcore or punk. You can.
Yeah. I mean, I'm from Chicago. I'm a almost lifelong Chicagoan. So it's for me, Naked Ray Gun's probably the most important to me.
I would argue that. Yeah, that's true.
And maybe Los Crudos.
Okay. Yeah, they're
I also
undeniably amazing. I love Crudos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To be fair, the first like 3 or 4 Styx records are really awesome.
Well, I was gonna say Etrope, but that's just the metal dude in me. Like, Amnesty and Life of Crime.
Do you like Trouble?
I love Trouble, but I like, it's funny, like compared, Trouble was contemporary to Etrope, because people don't understand that Etrope was started in the 70s. They didn't do anything until the 80s, but they started in the 70s. But I came to Etrope first, Trouble later, but Amnesty and Life of Crime, I just love those records so much, and I came to Trouble through them because Barry Stearns eventually was playing in Trouble. So before he died. So that, I love those bands. But as far as hardcore punk bands, like Crudos really just takes it. I mean, they were just like, I love Naked Ray Gun. I like some Articles of Faith. Effigies don't do too much for me, but I appreciate them. Big Black's always been interesting, but Crudos is just, they're just great. And look, I'm buddies with Ebro, so it's kind of hard to not, like your friend's band. So,
Well, and I don't think it's any sort of exaggeration to say that Crudos changed the landscape, not only of Chicago, maybe not even just of the Midwest, but like
nationwide.
Yeah.
They were not just nationwide. I mean, they toured like, places that hardcore bands hadn't gone, like South America and stuff, and just what they did for, music coming out of other places.
Yeah, we played
influential.
I played a show with a band called Fun People at Speaking Tongues.
Yes.
An early Don Austin show, and they wouldn't have come up here, I don't think, if Crudos had broke ground down there. So
Yes, I saw them and Crudos at the Fireside.
mhm.
They were yeah, Fun People was so good, so good.
It's a funny story. I went up to talk to them afterwards, and their English was real, dicey, but it was still better than my Spanish, 100%. And Josh, who I had known for a long time, since like '92, and 10, this is close to 10 years, and Josh just started speaking fluent Spanish. I looked at Josh, I was like, when did you start speaking Spanish? He goes, I've always spoke Spanish. I'm like, oh, well, okay. So that's Ohio public schools for you, so.
And it was funny that you brought up Big Black. Is I have the songs about fucking, and I have a 6-year-old, so it's like, she's reading now. Let me put that record away and not leave it out.
Yeah, I kind of worry about when my girls start getting older, and I have an 18-year-old son as well, but when my daughters start getting to a certain age, I'm kind of wondering what I'm going to do with some albums, as far as like where I'm going to put those, because I might not be ready to have the conversations they want to have after they discover them. So
Yeah, it's being a parent. It's like, all right, well, I will have this conversation. I'm fine having this conversation. I don't want it to be because of punk rock and hardcore lyrics and albums.
yeah, especially when you can't really put it in proper context. That's most
Yeah.
of it. I never.
My daughter.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you're fine.
My daughter was at her friend's house, and the friend's aunt and uncle were like, "Oh, we're putting on music. What's your favorite music, Asha?" And she goes, "Sick of it all." And so they're like, okay. And they put it on Spotify. They were like, what are you having your kid listen to? And I was like, Sick of it all.
Rich, do you remember when at the beginning of the year, everybody put up online, I think it was in the demo listen group, where everybody's putting their most listened to songs on Apple and Spotify and stuff? Do you remember what my number one song was?
No. What was it?
It was You're Welcome by Dwayne Johnson from the Moana soundtrack, because I listen.
Oh yeah,
I
you and Sean have that problem.
yeah, I have a playlist of all those songs for my kids for when I listen to when they're in the car. And I don't have any hatred for any of that kind of music like some people do. I don't really love it either, but my attitude is like, let kids be kids. They'll come to the music that they're eventually going to come to on their own, right? So I listen. Daddy, play You're Welcome. Okay. So it was just hysterical that, like, of the top 10 songs, all of them were from Disney soundtracks except for one or two. And the number one was You're Welcome, by The Rock. So it's kind of hysterical, I think it's funny,
Yeah, mine was riddled with, because in the car, my daughter she's at that age where she likes a song and she wants to hear it on
Yeah.
repeat over and over. And so it's like the Jesus Christ Superstar soundtrack
Uh-huh.
is like on repeat all the time. And so it's like, the things I listen to, and then, that, and you're just like, all right, I'm not posting this online for what to judge me. Like, what are you listening to, Sean? Like,
I thought it was funny. I was like, yeah, here you go. That's what's going on my Apple. I mean, I only really listen to that stuff in the car. I don't really listen to a lot of other kinds of music in the car, except for that, because I usually just listen to my records when I'm at home, so I was like, well, yeah, that's what I'm listening to in the car. So I didn't really have any problem with it. But I hear you. It's just like, people give you sideways glances if they see that in your playlist. So
Kind of, but like the last time we did that at the end of last year, I mean, honestly, and this isn't in any way self-aggrandizing, but I think I was one of the people who had, it was almost all like hardcore punk and a little metal and a little classic rock. but like, yeah, I mean, a lot, especially with Spotify, people are maybe listening to their to their punk and metal on vinyl or a cassette or CD even, and then listening to stuff that either their girlfriends or wives or kids like on Spotify or Apple Music or whatever.
Oh, it's absolutely the way I do it is, in the car, I'm listening to podcasts or, just something poppier. Um, and then at home, I just spin like hardcore records and stuff. So I'd rather listen on my record player, but in the car, until I figure out how to mount a turntable on my dashboard, and it's going to be the Spotify.
Yeah, I listen to a lot of podcasts in the car as well, but I even have to do that when there's when the kids aren't there, because it's hard for me to focus on what I'm hearing. I think I just don't listen to a lot of music digitally just out of habit. It has nothing to do with like any kind of like, oh, Spotify is evil or Apple Music is evil or anything of that nature, although I really don't care for either as far as their business practices go. But it's just more to do with like, that's just how I've always done it. So I'm just going to continue to do it that way, at least generally. Another weird thing that's been going on, and it's not been going on like real super recent, but over the past maybe 10 years, the reintroduction of cassettes into the world, and that becoming a format that people are really looking at. I pretty much kind of, other than demos that I've had for decades now, I kind of purged all my cassettes and just got records, and man, I'm not buying any new cassettes. I have a cassette player, but I'm not willing to make that commitment again. I'm like,
I just released my label, a band, and we did it. People were like, "Are you gonna do it on cassette?" I'm like, "All right, I guess." And I don't even own a cassette player. Like,
yeah,
I don't have a cassette player, so I'm like, I can't even listen to this thing that I put out. I'm like, I'll just listen to it on vinyl, like a regular person.
yeah. I mean, it's like, and it's not like I think it's low rent or anything like that. It's just like, I don't want to go back to something I had done before and eventually got rid of, because I just wasn't listening to them. I wasn't listening to cassettes. So, but like I said, I kept all the demos of bands that that I played shows with and came up with. I still have all that, and I still have an operating cassette player and that whole thing. But I'm not going to buy a new cassette by a band. Now that might be something I'll listen to digitally, or at least until they press it on a 7-inch. But I don't know. That's been, for me, that's been strange looking how popular that's become to do cassette releases.
Part of it is just people always want to do something throwback, and then there's always gonna be people that want something physical.
Yeah,
And cassettes are super
economical.
cheap to make. And, you don't need anybody to do anything. You can still do that at home, and in your printer, print out the J card for it, and then copy the cassette on your house. You don't need anything from anybody. Whereas if you want to do a 7-inch or an LP, like you can't. Like that's even to do lathe cuts, it's still a sizable investment.
Yeah, the only reason Persistent Aggressor did a 12-inch LP at all is because that's what we wanted. It had nothing to do with any illusion that we were ever going to get rid of all of them. It was very much a vanity project. We knew that, like, look, they're expensive. We're probably not going to sell all these because we're not a touring band. But it's what we wanted. We could have done cassettes. We could have just done strictly a digital release, but we were like, we knew going into it, we were going to lose our shirt, just because that's the way things are, we didn't really have any of these problems in the past because the bands I was in prior to that, people were, I was in touring bands and people were buying vinyl, and digital hadn't really, taken over everything just yet. So, and it was still cheap to get 7 inches done, at least relatively cheap. So,
oh yeah, the price of vinyl has skyrocketed.
yeah. Do you think
my understanding?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, you got
Oh, I
it.
was just gonna say, is it cheaper at this point to do 12-inch vinyl than 7 inches? I guess that's for Sean more than
It
anything.
no, it's not. I mean, the actual record itself, it is not that much more expensive to do a 12-inch. Where you save money with the 7 inches, you can do a fold over cover and get that printed a lot cheaper because you can outsource that to, you know, competitive print shops. Whereas an LP jacket, unless you know, hand screen them or something, there's not very many places that actually print those, so you're
Hmm.
kind of stuck getting them out of Canada. They're
Well,
expensive.
we also stubbornly decided to go strictly local. There's a pressing plant in Cleveland called Gotta Groove, and we're like, we're gonna keep our business here. You know, so it's like we
Well,
really kind of were like, that's what we're going with them. And I said to Dave and him, I said, should we think about a couple of these Canadian places? Because I'm buddies with Simon Harvey, who's done Ugly Pop forever, and he had given me some advice on you could try here, here, and here. They're like, no, we're just gonna do it in Cleveland, you know, which
oh,
didn't
we're like
help
cut
us
from the
at
same
all.
cloth. Yeah, I have
Yeah.
on my label. I have a pressing plant like 3 or 4 miles from me in
Uh-huh.
Chicago, and I'm like, nope, that's where I'm going. Like,
Yeah.
I want to do everything as local as possible. I mean, the actual jackets themselves, I'm sure Gotta Groove gets them from the actual jackets printed in Canada. I think everybody does, like, and then just they do the pressing. But um, you know, the vinyl itself, yeah, I'm like, why would I send it off to the Czech Republic
Right.
or, you know, some other place when I
Pick
can
them up.
literally I could text the owner and be like, hey, can I stop by and see how the records look? Yeah, all right, come on over.
Yeah, we have
I
a
imagine that freight from the Czech Republic's got to be ridiculous too. So
yeah. We have a lot of friends that work at Gotta Groove. You know, like people actually press the actual records. I have a guy who I was in a band with that does the quality control there. You know, so it just made sense to us. Like as far as like, well, it didn't really make sense to us. It was just like, well, we're just gonna do it here. You know, and I mean, we saved a lot of money in that our guitar player has his own studio, like an actual operating recording studio that he does bands in. So we didn't cost us a thing to record the LP. Dave did it all there. So you know, I guess that's another consideration we thought about when we were doing the LP. It's like, well, we didn't have to spend money on recording costs, so why not just do an LP? Why not just do it here? You know, so you know,
So what's next for Persistent Aggressor?
I honestly don't know. When the pandemic hit, uh, you know, the band is all over the state. Josh lives in Columbus. Dave and John live in Cleveland. Mikey and I live in the Akron area. And you know, when we wrote the LP, we did it all remotely. Like we'd write songs on our various instruments and share them in a Dropbox file, and then Dave would then do rough demos and share them with us, and we'd say, okay, we like this and this. And we hadn't, when we were writing this LP, we hadn't rehearsed together at all. Like everything was just done this way. And then we started recording, and then we started playing a few shows, and the pandemic hit, and we just haven't really discussed much of anything since then. We've written a bunch of stuff, but and shared stuff, but nobody's really made any moves to like say, okay, maybe we should start demoing this and putting this together. There was loose talk a while ago about us doing like an EP of some kind, but that's all it was, you know. So when shows start up, I'm not even sure. I mean, we didn't break up. It's nothing like that. It's, you know, one, we live real far apart and everybody's in a dozen bands except for me. Like Dave plays guitar with us, but he also plays drums in a band called Death Crawl. John, our drummer, is in a metal band called Axioma. He's in Six Kills Nine with guys from Keel Hall. He's in Jesus Egg. He's in 3 other bands. He's a professional drummer on top of that. He plays pickup gigs to make money, and he teaches drumming at CSU. So he's like a professional drummer. Josh lives in Columbus, and he does his own stuff. And Mikey, our bass player, he's in like 3 or 4 other bands too. So it's kind of like it just the pandemic made it real easy to put everything on the back burner unintentionally. So I don't really know what our plan is necessarily. We've got songs, we have enough for an LP, but the plan was possibly to do an EP, and that's why I started doing the podcast, because I was like, well, I don't have the outlet of playing in a band or practicing. And anybody who's been in a band can tell you that the first half of practice is everybody just talking about music, right? So I wasn't even getting that. So I said, well, I'm just going to do a podcast because everybody else in the world was doing it. And I figured, let me figure this out. Just like being in a band, I decided, well, I'm going to figure this out and try to do this. So I don't know what's going to happen with Persistent Aggressor necessarily. But we'll see. We'll see.
Well, Larry, thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate it. It's been great. Do you want to let people know what's something you've been listening to that you think everyone should check out?
Well, I mean, everybody's really kind of what do the kids say, big upping that Slant LP, and they're not wrong. I really like that record a lot. The Chisel's another band everybody seems to be talking about quite a bit, and I like both of those. I got those 2 singles. Those are really good. Most of the stuff I tend to listen to is a bit older. There's a lot of music in my life that I've sort of let get by me for various reasons, because when you're waist deep in a certain scene, you kind of have a pretty narrow tunnel vision. So I've been picking up a lot of older stuff, and it's but yeah, as far as newer, you know what? I'm forgetting myself. This is ridiculous. There's a really great band from the Akron area called Wall Creeper, and they just did a discography.
Oh, they're so good.
Yeah, those
Actually,
guys.
I showed that video from you.
Those guys are really, really good. And Sean, actually, he was very kind and had some nice things to say about my band, Don Austin. He was pretty young when we were a band, and I was pretty old then when I was in that band too. But they're really good. There's another band from Cleveland called Pillars that actually did a split with Wall Creeper that was pretty decent. I like them. They're kind of they ride that line between like crust punk and doom sludge stuff. They have like a lot of fast parts, but they're just really gnarly sounding.
Well, like Dystopia or
no, it's just
Stormcrow, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. I would just listen to them. You'll like it. At least I think you'll like it. I like them. Yep. Soul Charge from Cleveland is pretty good. It's got some people from Run Devil Run in it, and Harvey Picar are in that band, and the former bass player from Pillars plays bass with them. Goose is a really good metal band from the Akron area. They're a 3-piece. They, people, if they're being lazy, would say that they're a stoner sludge band, but they're a little bit more than that. I can't keep up with all the Fistula releases. They've been around since I was in the UnHoly Three. They've been around since like the mid-90s, and they've just been putting record after record out. And I tend to prefer the earlier stuff, but they put out a record. God, it's really old now, I guess, called Northern Aggression. It was really good, but they continuously keep putting stuff out. There's just so much of it. It's daunting. There's a really good band called Actual Form from around here, and they're kind of like, they don't sound like Don Caballero, but they're of that ilk. Like, they're very acrobatic musically, but they're heavier than that and a little more intense. It's like they're like the halfway point between Keel Hall and Don Caballero, if you can imagine that. So that sort of thing.
2 reference points out 2 bands I haven't thought of in ages, actually.
Yeah. Oh, and the guys, there are guys from Incantation is in a band with Aaron Dallison from Keel Hall and Matt Sorg from Ringworm called Perdition Sect, and they put out an LP a couple months ago, and that one's pretty good. It's straight up D-beat worship kind of stuff. You know, it doesn't sound like anything any of those guys have been in prior. Axioma are drummers in that, and they call themselves dark metal, but they're kind of like, there are a lot of black metal influences, but you know, there's, you know, the scene around here in general, not just Akron, but Cleveland is pretty diverse, and the bands, you know, cover a lot of ground because it's smaller than a lot of other towns. So there's a lot of diversity, and people just, you know, that's, you know, a lot of the references I just made are bands from other kind of genres and stuff, which I think is totally healthy. But yeah, Wall Creeper always comes to mind. Feds is another really good hardcore band. But yeah, I listen to a lot of local stuff. But as far as more recent stuff from elsewhere, Slant and The Chisel, Laughing Gas is pretty good. See All, Permission, listen to those records quite a bit. So yeah, that's it.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you for having me. Sorry for the rambling nature of my answers. Oftentimes I just kind of go with just whatever's coming out, you know.
Listen, Rich and I are the same, you know, the similar age where we just rant.
Yeah.
That's what we do.
Yeah,
I shut up, Grandpa. Here's your butterscotch pudding snack.
Yeah, exactly. I was waiting for you guys to offer me that, and I was particularly taken aback when Rich called Don Austin legendary. I almost guffawed at that one. I'm like, who do you think you're talking to? You know, it's kind of like that made me feel exceptionally old, because our last show was 2006. So, and I was rambling back then, so it's even worse now, you know.
All right. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.